kind to you, and if not, maybe the story you're about to hear will bring a little warmth to your heart. Sometimes, life corners us into impossible choices, where survival demands sacrifice, and desperation whispers louder than dreams. But often, it's in those very moments of darkness that love shows up, in the most unexpected form. This story is about a young woman who thought she was selling her soul for a cold, calculated deal, only to find herself swept into a storm of desire, devotion, and dangerous affection. It's a journey of survival and surrender, of pain and passion, of discovering that the heart doesn't always follow the rules we write. So take a breath, lean in, and let the story unfold. And this is where the story begins, not with love, but with desperation. Lena Hart sat alone in her tiny apartment, where the dim light barely pushed back the dark, and silence settled heavy on her shoulders like grief. On the table in front of her lay hospital bills, crumpled, creased, and marked with red, each one a quiet, merciless reminder that time was running out. Her mother's life depended on machines now, machines that demanded money she didn't have. Lena was just a cashier. No power, no privilege, no miracle, waiting around the corner. She had worked double shifts, skipped meals, pawned every valuable thing she owned, even borrowed from the kind of people you never borrow from. She was willing to sell her soul, but even that, it seemed, wasn't enough. And then the phone rang. "Miss Lena Hart?" The voice was deep, measured, the kind of voice used to being feared, not questioned. "This is Damien Cross. I understand you're looking for a way out. I can give you one if you're willing to pay the price." Lena froze. That name! Everyone knew it. Damien Cross, the reclusive architectural mastermind. His buildings were breathtaking. His terms? Ruthless. He never offered help unless what he wanted in return was even more valuable. "Tomorrow, 9 p.m., my office." Not an invitation, a command. Lena didn't want to go, but she also couldn't sit and watch her mother slip away. Not when there was still a sliver of hope, no matter how dangerous it looked. So the next night, dressed in borrowed confidence and worn-out shoes, she stepped into a world of glass and marble, unaware that one conversation would change her life forever. The elevator doors slid open, and Lena stepped into his world. The top floor of the building was a masterpiece of glass and black marble, vast, sleek, and cold. Everything about it was intentional, immaculate, like Damien Cross himself. He stood by the window, city lights casting silver shadows across his sharp features, a crystal glass of scotch in hand. "You came," he said simply, his voice as smooth and controlled as the man himself. Lena swallowed hard. Her fingers clutched the strap of her worn purse. "Why am I here?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Damien turned slowly, every movement deliberate, like a predator who didn't need to chase. "I know your situation, Lena. I know about your mother, and I know what you're willing to do to keep her alive." Her heart stuttered. She didn't ask how he knew. Men like Damien didn't ask. They uncovered. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm not asking for love or loyalty. All I want is a child." The words slammed into her. "You carry my baby. I erase your debt. Once the child is born, we part ways. No strings." It wasn't an offer. It was a transaction, one signed in silence and desperation. The choice lay before her, merciless, sharp, and irreversible. But somewhere behind Damien's icy stare, something flickered, something she couldn't yet name. When Lena signed the contract, something inside her went still. Damien didn't say a word. He simply stared at her for a long moment, like he was reading every fracture in her soul, then gave a small nod. "Come with me." No question, no explanation, just a quiet command. She followed him out of the building and into the sleek black car waiting at the curb. Lena didn't ask where they were going. The answer had already been written into the contract. His penthouse sat high above the city, glass walls revealing a skyline that looked like a field of stars. The space was breathtaking, but it was the silence that truly unnerved her. Everything here seemed designed to strip a person of their defenses. Damien poured himself a drink, then handed her a glass of water instead. "I'm not rushing anything," he said quietly. "But this isn't just theory anymore." Lena nodded, her throat dry. He moved closer, stopping just in front of her. "I won't touch you without your consent. But understand this, once we begin, there's no halfway, no turning back." "I understand," she whispered. That night, Damien didn't devour her. He didn't act on impulse. Every motion was intentional. Every glance, a question. Every touch, a quiet claim. He explored her body not with greed, but with precision, with quiet power. And when he realized she was untouched, his body froze. He looked at her, really looked at her, then leaned in, voice low, possessive. "Then, you're mine," he whispered, "not just for tonight, for as long as you breathe." Since that night, nothing had been the same. Lena woke in a room that didn't belong to her. The silk curtains whispered in the breeze, sunlight stretching gently across her skin like a dream too beautiful and too foreign to claim as her own. Beside her, Damien still slept, one arm draped firmly around her waist, holding her like she might vanish if he loosened his grip. There was nothing in the contract about this, nothing about him holding her like she mattered, nothing about comfort or warmth or silence shared at dawn. And from that moment, everything began to shift. Damien no longer treated her like a transaction. He noticed the way she stirred cream into her coffee, how she lingered near windows as if longing for something far away. He brought her books without asking. He kissed her forehead before heading to meetings. But along with tenderness came something else. Control. At first it was simple. Where are you going? Who called you? Will you be back before dark? Then came quiet shadows. Men in suits posted near the elevator, chauffeurs waiting outside stores she hadn't told him she'd visit. And one night, after a man in the elevator looked at her too long, Damien had returned home and shattered a glass against the wall. It terrified her, and yet part of her felt strangely safe. There was something maddening about being the center of someone's world, something intoxicating about knowing you were wanted, not just wanted, but needed in a way that consumed. One evening, Lena stood in the walk-in closet, a space larger than her entire old apartment. Rows of silk, lace, and designer heels stared back at her like strangers. This wasn't her world. It was Damien's. She looked at her reflection, barefaced, quiet, lost. And for the first time since this all began, she asked herself, who am I to him? A lover? A possession? Or just a signed contract with skin? At dinner, she barely touched her food. The clink of silverware echoed too loudly. Then, softly, she said it, "I think I should go back to my apartment." Damien didn't move right away, but when he looked up, the air changed. He stood, walked toward her slowly like every step was deliberate, dangerous. "No," he said, voice low and final. "You stepped into my world, Lena, and I won't let you walk out of it." She trembled, but when his hand reached for her face, brushing gently beneath her chin, she saw something new in his eyes. Not just obsession, but fear, and something close to love. Time passed quietly, but something inside Lena was changing. Exhaustion, morning nausea, strange emotions she couldn't explain. Then one afternoon, standing in front of the mirror, her hand drifted to her stomach. Gentle, instinctive, and she knew she was pregnant. Lena stood frozen in the bathroom, the pregnancy test trembling in her hand. 2 clear red lines stared back at her. Her heart didn't race, it sank, heavy and slow, as if struggling to process what this meant. This was the goal, this was the reason she stayed. But why did it terrify her now? Maybe because nothing about this felt like a contract anymore. When Damien returned home that evening, Lena was waiting for him in the living room. No pretense, no dramatic pause, just one quiet sentence. "I'm pregnant?" He stopped in his tracks, his eyes darkened, his entire frame still. Then slowly he walked toward her. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. And Lena, for the first time, feared he'd simply nod, acknowledge it like a business milestone, nothing more. But instead, Damien dropped to his knees. Not in arrogance, not in performance, just a man kneeling before the woman he couldn't afford to lose. "From the moment you walked into my life," he whispered, "I haven't been the same. I planned to let you go after the child, but I can't, not anymore." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black velvet box. The ring inside shimmered under the soft light. Not because of the diamonds, but because of what it meant. "Lena, I don't want you just as the mother of my child. I want you as my wife, as my family." Lena blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't dared to imagine it. "I thought this was a deal," Damien continued, his voice thick. "But you changed me. You made me feel again, and I'm scared, terrified of losing you." She looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling in front of her. He wasn't the cold billionaire anymore. He was just Damien. A man in love, stripped of armor, begging for a place in her heart. Her hand rested over her belly. Inside her, life was growing, and around her, a family was forming. Damien Cross never imagined he'd be this kind of man. He, the billionaire who once prioritized a boardroom over his brother's birthday, who signed a $100 million deal during a partner's funeral, was now sitting in an OB-GYN clinic, clutching Lena's hand like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "It's just a routine checkup," Lena whispered, half laughing at the tense expression carved into his face. "There's no such thing as just, not when it's about you and the baby," Damien replied, eyes still locked on the door where the doctor would soon appear. Since the moment he learned she was pregnant, Damien had changed, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with quiet consistency. He read every book on pregnancy he could find. He hired a nutritionist to track Lena's meals down to the last vitamin. He replaced their mattress because she mentioned back pain. But the part that melted Lena most happened every morning. Before she was fully awake, Damien would sit beside her. He'd gently pull down the blanket, lean in, kiss her belly, and whisper the same tender words. "Good morning, little one. Daddy's here." Every single day. Without fail. Sometimes Lena pretended to be asleep, just to hear him say it. Other times she'd peek through barely opened eyes and catch him staring at her with something unspoken, something no contract could contain. He started designing the nursery himself, not outsourcing it, not delegating it. Damien chose every color, every fixture, every shadow of light that would touch their child. One day, Lena teased him, "Do you design every client's nursery this perfectly?" Damien placed a hand on her stomach, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've never built a home for anyone," he said. "You and this baby are my first blueprint I'm terrified to get wrong." Time had passed like a blueprint drawn gently across the canvas of their lives. The edges that once felt sharp were now softened by the quiet rhythm of everyday love. Damien, once consumed by architectural perfection and concrete dreams, had long shifted his focus to something far more delicate, Lena and the life growing within her. On a warm, sun-drenched morning, Lena stirred in bed, a sharp ache rippling through her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it, but when the second wave came, deeper, longer, she turned toward Damien and whispered his name. He was up in an instant, disoriented but alert, his hands trembling as he scrambled to get dressed and gather the hospital bag. In all the years of presenting monumental designs and defending grand ideas, nothing had prepared him for the helpless panic he felt in that moment. "Are you sure? Should I call the doctor?" "Should we?" "Damien," she said, voice tight with both amusement and pain, "I think my water just answered that for you." The drive to the hospital was a blur. Damien never once let go of her hand, never once stopped looking at her, as if he could will the pain away through sheer presence. For hours, he stayed by her side, whispering encouragements, brushing damp hair from her face, holding her hand through every contraction. And when at last their daughter's first cry filled the room, sharp and beautiful, Damien's heart stopped. A nurse placed the small pink bundle into his arms. And as he looked down at the tiny fingers wrapping instinctively around his thumb, something broke inside him. He cried, without hesitation, without shame, just a man, undone by love he never saw coming. Bringing Lena and their daughter home was another kind of transformation. The sleek, modern lines of his penthouse had softened with baby blankets, lullabies, and midnight feedings. Damien, the architect known for controlling every detail of a structure, found himself fumbling with diapers and baby bottles, tripping over pacifiers, learning how to hum lullabies between meetings. He read parenting books between blueprint drafts and designed a rocking chair just to suit Lena's posture when nursing. Every cry, every yawn, every breath from that tiny mouth became the pulse that guided his days. And Lena, watching him navigate fatherhood with sleepless eyes and milk-stained shirts, had never loved him more. A year passed, and with it came their daughter's first birthday. Damien hosted it in the garden of the country home he had designed just for them, a space not for show, but for growth, for laughter, for love. After the candles were blown and the cake half-eaten, he lifted his daughter in one arm and reached into his pocket with the other, handing Lena a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver necklace, and then another, smaller, engraved with their daughter's name. "I owe you more than just a wedding," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I owe you the life I never knew I wanted." Lena looked at him, surprised and speechless. "Not because I promised it," he continued, "but because you've given me everything. A daughter, a home, a reason to wake up and build a life not out of steel and stone, but out of love." 3 months later, under the golden blush of late spring, they stood in that same garden, surrounded by the few who mattered most. Lena wore a simple dress, their daughter toddled down the aisle in white, and Damien, eyes full of quiet joy, vowed not just to be a husband, but to be the man she had already believed he could become. That evening, after the guests had left and the house fell silent again, they sat side by side on the couch. Between them, their daughter slept soundly, cheeks flushed, fingers curled around a soft blanket. Damien wrapped his arm around Lena and kissed the top of her head. "I've designed hundreds of buildings," he whispered, "but this is the first time I've ever built something that truly feels like home." Lena smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't need to speak. Love no longer needed grand gestures or architectural marvels. It had already taken shape. In every midnight feeding, every sleepy smile, every breath of the little girl asleep between them. And in that silent, sacred moment, they watched their daughter sleep, knowing that of all the things they'd built, she was their most beautiful, most eternal masterpiece.